Panel on side OG, we have never been prouder to stand against the extractive neocolonialism that is perpetuated by the IMF when they put arbitrary and destructive terms on countries that are in the midst of development that immensely need our help. That is a significant principled win, so proud to take it. So, instead of, why do we think that there are incentives to do policies that are done, why do we think there are good political incentives for countries to put policies in place when they are not imposed by the IMF? Firstly, we think that a lot of developing countries are to some extent democratic, and often their democracy, democratic success is strongly predicated on economic success. But even if you don't think they're democratically successful, a lot of authoritarian leaders stay in power because of economic success they can bring to their country. And thirdly, because we don't think that the most rogue states are likely to be getting loans from the IMF, we think they're often embargoed and sanctioned. What this means is that we think that even if the IMF doesn't impose loan conditions that may sometimes be favourable to these countries, the countries are likely to do it themselves. But the harm that we avoid is having incredibly bad loan conditions imposed on these countries. The point of all of this is that even if you believe that these countries are likely to suffer from elite capture, they will greatly benefit from the country doing well, and we're still very happy to stand for our anti-corruption. That's an incredibly important impact in this debate. Happy to take closing if they have a POI.
If countries can implement good economic policy anyway, why do they oftentimes need an injection of capital?
I think that there's a very large number of reasons that's true. I think extractive colonialism has often destabilised these countries. Intervention by Western powers has often destabilised these countries. But also everyone needs injections of capital. I think the fact that you put economic terms on those things doesn't reveal anything about the nature of these countries. Like I've just spent a minute saying, they're probably going to do policies that are good for their own economic incentives. The thing that happens on our side is that Western countries aren't able to bully them and pressure them and threaten them with starvation if they don't put in pro-Western policies. So, principally, why do we think these conditions are so wrong? We think it's firstly incredibly coercive. Sure.
So, just to be clear, if you don't support our conditions, what types of conditions, if you have any conditions whatsoever, will you support on your side?
Sure, we're happy to support things like not saying you can't run a budget deficit or democracy, so people being able to choose the conditions they support. We think the thing is that countries are different, that they won't always benefit from the same sets of conditions. We think the best people to decide those are the economists employed by governments in those countries and things like that. Firstly, we think it is highly coercive to opt into these loans. That is, these countries need the money desperately. They often have millions of people languishing without economic development, and so they're willing to make sacrifices that are principled and political in order to get them. Secondly, we think that the end point of this is that they lose a significant amount of autonomy by taking these loans. But secondly, we think that it is a principled wrong, in fact, for the IMF to offer or to coerce countries into these conditions. That is firstly because it is not done with the best interests of these countries at heart. I think there is a significant difference between, economic white papers and things like that, and saying you cannot have a loan unless you put a structural adjustment program in place. We're saying you cannot have a loan if you're willing to run budget deficits or have high minimum wages and things like that. But secondly, because there is a significant amount of historical evidence that these policies are bad and people continue to persist with them. That is, pro-market policies that have been forced upon countries like India by the IMF have been incredibly harmful in the past. We think that they perpetuate some of the worst ills, and injustices of colonialism. But thirdly, we think that to the extent that you could perhaps buy that it is a good thing to offer a loan and, there should be some kind of reciprocal give and take. We think that this is not justified. Firstly, we think that there is a huge amount of suffering within these countries, and so there is a moral obligation to offer, to give them ways to get out of this, to help them, without imposing extractive conditions. No, thank you. Secondly, we think that this harm is often caused by people who back the IMF, or was historically caused by them, and so we think that there probably isn't an obligation to accept, damaging terms when you probably were put in the very position by countries like England, or by countries like the US. But the third thing is that we think that the harm that it causes these countries is disproportionate and incredibly wrong compared to the, benefit that it might be reasonable for the IMF or IMF backers to receive. We think, again, there can be other mutually beneficial policies, and those are things we're happy to support, but we think that the best people to make decisions about a country's economic future are the people who vote for it, and that's something we're incredibly proud to stand behind. But the second thing is, in this speech, that the terms are likely to be incredibly harmful, no thank you, and damaging to the fate of the development of these countries and to the citizens within them. Firstly, why do we think these terms are going to be very bad? By way of example, I point to the impact of structural adjustment programs in India. The fact that pushing free market rules on a country that was in a nascent stage of development has caused huge harms. Arguably, India has missed the bus of regional development to a significant extent. I think that is a very clear problem. But some structural reasons for this. Firstly, because these policies often push a very pro-Western model of development, which I would note a lot of Western countries didn't even follow when, no thank you, follow while they were developing. That is, they oppose things like protectionism for nascent industries or fuel subsidies, which the West was very willing to do while they were developing. But secondly, because trade is a zero-sum game, and often these countries have an active, the countries that back the IMF have an active incentive to do things that are incredibly harmful. What does this look like? Making things that are highly advantageous to incredibly wealthy countries who are able to buy cheap exports from these countries while they're in the midst of their development. Yeah.
What are your structural reasons as to why a nation in Eastern Europe, Southern America, Southeast Asia knows what is best for its economic development?
Firstly, I think that there are universities in these countries. Secondly, I think that they have the capacity to employ a large number of economists. Thirdly, I think that there's incentives for people within bodies like the UN or even the IMF to provide economic advice, and countries are able to take it. But I think that this economic advice shouldn't be economic coercion, and I think that it's incredibly important. Thanks, guys. I think it's incredibly important that we allow people to make decisions, because I think that even if it is, by some free market version of economics, better to have really low minimum wages. When people are voting on the fact that they no longer can afford to eat because they have such low wages that are so incredibly good for people making investments in their country, that is really harmful. Because trade is such a zero-sum game, and there are so many benefits to being extractive, I think these policies are often, able to capitalize on the coercion that is inherent in the fact that some countries are incredibly wealthy and other countries have been consistently marginalized and extensively harmed by the system of capitalism that currently exists. I think this is incredibly important, an incredibly important impact in this debate, because I think, panel, that as Eleanor's going to explain to you, we're very likely to still get loans. I think they are politically popular within countries to do foreign aid. I think there's a lot of value to it. We can still get mutually beneficial things if people, for example, vote for a free trade deal. But on side opening government, we don't stand for any incredibly harmful, malicious imposition of these terms. So incredibly proud to oppose, so proud to be from Madrid.
Thank the Prime Minister for a fine speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for the opposition bench.
I'm sorry, I'm not speaking like this. Okay, I'll take from the Bulgarians. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I know the stereotype about us that we will run crazy pro-capitalist case in front of you that leads to money growth and big business. But we're going to be reasonable in front of you. And what we're going to tell you is that these conditions are the necessary balance to stop excessive overspending in this particular case, so that we, even though we may have some kind of sacrifices in the short term, for other future crises that hit, we're able to pay off these particular things and not plunge these economies into particular crises. First point of framing, why are these likely to be good conditions that may grow? Firstly, I assume that this is a step-by-step process that will most likely happen. So you won't impose 100% of these conditions from today in this particular case, but most likely certain percentages up to certain days in this particular case. Secondly, I also think IMF wants to do this in a constructive and adequate way by giving consultancy, information, and sharing adequate pieces of this sort of case. Why is this a likely characterization? Number one, you don't want to be seen as bullies, because this is directly influenced in media by the countries who fund this particular fund in the West, who will portray a narrative that they are bankrupt in these countries, they're strong-arming them, and all because of all of the rhetoric that you hear from this Australian team right here. And these people are, how to say, very liberal, they're middle class, they care about these particular issues, they don't necessarily pressure their government. Now, because the government doesn't want, how to say, scandal on their hands, they're necessarily like to do this. But second, they're just strategic reasons for you to do this. Like, number one, you most likely don't want to create huge shock into this particular economy by just imposing these conditions from tomorrow. But second, you also want these countries to cooperate with you, because you have some kind of legitimacy in front of this organization. Like, each year you have to show your KPI, this is how we've been working well with these countries, this is why this is good in order to continue doing this particular case. Now, why absent these policies, do countries in these regions have have structural incentives to overspend. Two reasons. Firstly, they want to win elections. What are the things that they're likely to do? Number one, they like to fund state-owned workers that exist in administrations, government companies in this particular case. Because these are people whose employment is directly connected with the ruling party right now, it's the surest way for you to guarantee democratic elections and today to vote to you when you know that the money in your hat is coming from the ruling party in this particular case. But secondly, they're likely to fund pointless processes, building a road to nowhere, building a highway to nowhere, building a port that there isn't a ship there. Or let's be nuanced here. Not that extent of these things are that important, right? Like not that percent of of ships are in this port in this particular case. Or just funding companies that aren't necessarily important, like carpentry industry in this particular case, mining industry, even though it's not strategic. Because this is the way that you buy out people who are ready to say, ah yes, the government did this particular thing, I will vote for this person. But thirdly, straight corruption in this particular case. And I know their side says that they keep corruption, but here's the comparative. IMF is impossible to control corruption 100%, and so far as they're expanding government spending, so they're expanding different streams of money going into the economy, it's far easier for you as per employer to give money to people that are very close to you, people that you will be loyal to in this particular case. But secondly, voters in these regions aren't the most educated ones and aren't the most adequate ones. For the structural reasons the opening government gives you, all the processes that you have, colonialism, communists running your country for 50 years in this particular case, lack of money, all of these things means that you don't necessarily think critically in this particular case. But secondly, democracy in many of these countries has existed very, very rarely. So there aren't accountability checks, there aren't institutions. Why is this argument important? Because you're likely to vote for pro-left communist party that comes into this power, or the majority of political parties to be left-leaning in this particular case, and to have a coalition between center-left and far-left, that necessarily because they want to, give promises back to their people, they do this. This is comparatively better on our side, because they can always say, oh no, IMF tied their hands, we can't do it guys. This is the problem in this particular case. I'll necessarily explain to you why this leads to more growth, that will mean that these countries are better able to pay off the loans in the future and stop correct these problems. But before that, CG, you have
Yes. The economy is the most important voting issue. If it gets worse on your side, why wouldn't people vote the people in power out?
But look, you vote the people in power out. But then the damage is already done, firstly. But secondly, because I proved you structure, these people aren't the most educated. They're likely to be profited by future policies. And secondly, you forget that the crisis happened, right? In 10 years' time, when there's future crisis, you forget this particular case, because new political actors is coming to power, you vote for communists again in this particular case. Why is this necessary for more growth? Now, let's engage with all of the things that are emphasized, because panel did a very bad job. Firstly, interest rates. When interest rates are low, you're better able to get cheap loans that are directly used in the economy. This means that, for example, businesses can take out loans in order to start this particular business. Or consumers can take out loans and they can buy more stuff because the price on the loan is lower. This means that you're better able to increase, the total money circulation in the economy. But secondly, if you're an export-based economy, and structurally most of these countries are export-based because they have cheap labor, because they don't have tertiary sectors, because the people aren't that educated in this particular case, and there aren't strong labor regulations, so the currency is lower because of the interest rates, because the loans are cheap and there's multiple circulating currency in the economy. They're better able to export more because the ratio of Western currency to this currency is decreased. But secondly, straight up currency change. Many of these countries may do things like, for example, deposit policies where they mandate currency to exist in their economy, or secondly, to increase the ratio of their currency to the other side's currency, which necessarily means that you have less capacity as business to come in and set up, less capacity as business to operate in this particular case because you're doing this sort of thing. And thirdly, on the fertilizers thing, look, I'm not sure if this is fertilizers views. I view this as general monopoly argument, right? So country X has incentive to invest in certain sectors where they have close people with political ties with them, or they create their own voters because these are corporate votes that they can lose later. I think it depends to less than just fertilizer in this particular case. But when you create artificial monopolies by spending money in these sort of things, when these companies are already mandated, they're receiving money from the government, either direct cash on hand or this particular case via subsidies, they're able to create artificial market situation. There isn't any competition. When Gazprom is the only competition in this particular case, you as other energy company have no way to deal with them because they can price you out in these types of cases, because they've gotten the most educated workers with you in this particular case. All of these reasons and all of these processes mean that growth increases. Jobs are increased. People grow money over time in this particular case. And note, we don't have to be scoundrels. When inflation crisis hits, we'll increase interest rates to combat. Because everyone else around the world is also doing this. West, Eastern Europe, it doesn't matter. Everyone is doing this in particular. So this is likely to be done sensible, right? In this particular case. This means that you have less spending done by the government and more capacity for the government to pay out. So you get added benefit of job being created, but government is also better able to not spend this money. This is important because governments will likely to work with the IMF on both sides of the house because they like the loans. But when they're not able to pay, that's when they cut healthcare. That's when they cut other things that are important in this particular case, like how you say, expanding the expanding healthcare, expanding education, expanding all of these type of things. That's when government goes into crisis. For all these reasons, please oppose this motion.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for a fine speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case of the top vote.
That entire speech was essentially just trying to tell you that it's a harm to spend government money. I'm just going to point quickly to an example, which is the Asian tigers, which developed incredibly effectively without large-scale IMF loans with heavy conditions on them and with very large government spending. That was because there are actually big benefits of government spending when they tell you, oh, but there's going to be infrastructure projects. Oh my gosh, how terrible. They might build a road that could allow people to access a hospital or a school. They might build a road that would employ people and therefore give them the money that they need during a time of serious economic strain to actually buy the things they needed to live. I'm sorry, but I'm failing to see why this is such a harm in this debate, and it simply buys in to all sorts of Western narratives that have been pushed onto developing countries that say that this is the only way you can develop. You can only develop if you follow this model. Note, that was not something that had worked. We would point to the comparison between China and India, which one had been more effective at reducing poverty rates within their country and developing economically. Two reasons why we win this debate. Firstly, on the principle which gets entirely neglected in that speech and developed you at this. Secondly, because you're the only side that gets you better development. Alright. Firstly, on the principle, I think that I'm just going to point out that we give you really good analysis on this. Note the historical nature of the harm that had been done by the IMF specifically to a lot of developing countries. That was they had been significantly harmed by the structural adjustment programs that had been put onto them into the past. At the point at which this is you are reapplying those same sorts of conditions, you are continuing to compound a historical wrong that began at the point at which we had extractivism through colonialism. It's the point at which you deny them the autonomy because they simply cannot opt in to this process through proper consent at the point at which they rely on that money. They did not have the capacity to say no to this. You take away any sort of autonomy. Note that even if they tell you that this is going to be a terrible decision that's going to be made, we think that there is a principled reason why, that we get proven to you, why it is actually a good thing that they get to make this decision in the first place, that it is not pushed on them by a Western power that does not have, one, their best interests at heart, but even if they do, compounds the historical wrong that we tell you was so important in this debate, and that we had to allow them that autonomy back in one way that we possibly could when it was so difficult and so often taken away from them. Weigh this principle quite highly. It's something that's important in this debate, given that historical nature. It is something that we take a win on uncontingent now. Alright. Secondly then, we win this debate because we're the best for the development. I'm going to do some preemptive response in case CO comes out with something about why there's not going to be as much loaning of money if we take away conditions. A couple of reasons for this. Firstly, because the IMF literally exists in order to provide loans. But secondly, even if you didn't believe that there were actual benefits to having these countries having enough money to function. That was because lots of Western countries wanted to trade with them, wanted to benefit from the sorts of materials that were coming out of these countries, the manufacturing they did. That was much harder to benefit from at the point at which people do not have the money, governments do not have the money to function. But then thirdly, we thought that there was international reasons why different countries wanted to be perceived as good actors. That looked like things like China and the US both wanting to be seen as helping in order to have the most international influence. But there were also just states that were generally considered to be pretty good actors that gave away much more money than others. Some of the Scandinavian states come to mind. Alright, at that point it's pretty clear that there's still going to be money given on our side. The issue here now is whether or not it's used in better ways with or without structural reasons. So let's note here that the first thing they tell you is that, obviously they're not going to make good decisions if we don't impose on them a way to make decisions. Firstly, that's contingent on them proving that these restrictions are going to be good. I'm going to deal with that later. But secondly, I think that the reason why they're still likely to have good decisions being made, aside from that stuff about there's not enough people to make them, obviously there is a symmetric incentive from the IMF on both sides to do things like provide, advice, to provide people that they can consult with. Perhaps in fact there's more incentive to do things like provide economists on our side of the house, because you cannot simply say, do it like this. You actually have to say, here are the reasons why this might be good. Here are the reasons why here's how you could put this into place. That applied because they wanted to obviously still get certain returns, they still had certain views, but now you have the choice whether or not you wanted to opt into this. Obviously, to tell you at Live, there are reasons why you want your country to do well economically. Even if you believe that you're an authoritarian regime, often you're premised on how well economically you did in order to have the consent that meant that people did not protest all the time to knock down your regime. But I'm going to write a new back here as well. That note that you are now more likely to have the IMF do things like check up on your progress. Because rather than just saying, here's the condition, meet it, and then dump you with it, there was more of a incentive to make sure there is some level of transparency. What's happening with this money? Where is it going? And to continue to have things that were going to help that country to use it to the best of their ability. Next thing they tell you is that when we put these in place, you stop excessive overspending, and then you might want to, put this money into who knows what bad things that people don't like. Firstly, all the things they tell you are harms, I'm pretty much willing to cover good because they're spending generally on the people. Let's consider where the money is likely to be pulled out of at the point at which you cut spending. Because it wasn't going to be pulled out of mining. It wasn't going to be pulled out of things that were politically palatable and had masses of lobbying power behind them. It was going to be pulled out of things like welfare, like education, like rural stimulus programs that there was no political incentive to fund at the point at which you do not have the excess money to do so. Note then that all the sorts of harms they want to tell you about excess overspending probably apply the most on their side, because they're now under pressure to keep those companies, they keep those corporate interests on side when they do not have the same level of control, when they do not have the same level of money to spend on things. That was the point at which you are more likely to exacerbate that harm, because you funnel the money into the people who need it the most, need it the least, and you take it away from the people who need it most closing.
If you believe in the principled right to borrow however much money you want, why do you have some constraints like anti-corruption?
We don't believe in the principled right to borrow as much money as you want. We believe that these countries have been fucked over by colonialism. No, anti-corruption is separate to this. That was because it meant that the money went to the people in the country. We cared principally about the people within the country, more so than we cared about the governments. That was to ensure that that money got there, which is why it stood outside of the principle. But then lastly, they tell you that this is going to be really good conditions, because they're going to be put in place, firstly, step by step. Note that exacerbates the principled harm, right? At the point at which you opt into a loan, not knowing what the conditions are going to be in the long run, because you had no choice, that's when you lose the last remnants of your autonomy. But no, secondly, that also just doesn't show it's going to be good. We tell you that there are economic incentives for the places like the IMF to impose loans that are favourable to the West. But secondly, also, note that these institutions simply did not understand what was going to be best for these countries, because they did not have the same experience of knowing, what the conditions were like. It often came from a lack of information that came from arrogance looking out from the West in and imposing things that were not applicable inside. They lastly tell you then that there's going to be less investment because you see economically bad policy. I'm sorry, but firstly, obviously, there is still investment in all sorts of countries, especially at the point at which China is decoupling, China and the US are decoupling. They have to go into these other countries. That increases it. But empirically, it's simply not true. We've seen heaps of investment in South Korea and Taiwan, which have not had these same regulations imposed by the IMF, because we got you the best outcomes, and the principally and practically we're so proud to propose.
For a fine speech and call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition to conclude the top half.
Firstly, on the nature of the loans. I think we provided just structural reasons as to why it's very likely that these economies currently are export economies and why it specifically factors into the nature of why the particular conditions are actually very beneficial for these particular economies, especially in the long term when you gain the ability to diversify these economies, but also make sure that you have stable growth within the short term and middle term while building out this particular new diversification. So why is this nature going to be fairly okay? I think there are two main responses here. Firstly, in specific cases that there's obviously because we have to talk about multiple economies, right? In specific cases where a particular condition is extremely bad, especially in the short term, you still have the ability and the incentives, which I'm going to prove, to make sure that this doesn't hit you that much. E.g., for example, when the European Union implemented embargo on Russian oil, it did not implement it right away for particular countries that were over-dependent on it. For example, the Russian embargo for Bulgaria, Romania, and many of these countries was made as a condition after 2024, giving them enough time to basically recoup and make sure that they make different sources, so that the prices of this particular oil did not hit directly the consumers in these particular countries. So the question is, you obviously can do these things. Why do you have the incentive as the IMF to do these particular things? Obviously, in the long term, if these countries are seen as long-term investments, as opening their markets and things like that. And obviously the IMF is mostly like the money of Western countries who already have opened up and have market economies and would like their businesses to have access to the consumers in these places, but also make sure that these places produce good and effective stuff for them. Meaning that you have an incentive as an IMF in these countries to do it in the right way, to have a good idea and to basically have good image in front of these particular developing countries, and also make sure that like you're out competing China in the presence with this particular country. Meaning that you're likely to make this consensus when it matters the most. Not only in terms of timing, but when, for example, when 2020 hit, IMF restructured the loans for many of this particular country. They can restructure the timing. Even in the worst case scenario, they can remove the condition, but let's say they never remove the condition, I think they can definitely make it so the country can actually do it well. Why is it important to draw? It means that all of the short-term harms to these particular economies and countries that they can particularly claim are unlikely to happen. Meaning that all the long-term things that we talk in terms of stable growth and how these economies shift into better places are much more important. But second of all, in the short term, when you know that these are long-term conditions, you as an investor that directly puts money into business and things like that, when you know that they're likely to have stronger currency in the future, when you know that they're likely to have more good like interest rates and things like that, you're far more likely to go into these countries in the first place and invest right now, right away. But also, because of all the structural reasons of overspending that Truman gave you, it means that you're basically prepared to handle future crises that come to you, which is extremely important. Because look, you can help people with welfare right now, but I'm not sure if you have the political capital for welfare in these countries, why you wouldn't do it on both sides of the house. It's good to spend. Governments have incentive to spend on both sides of the house. We agree with them. The problem is when they overspend and they're not prepared for the next 4 years. And even if a new government comes, they still have the same incentives that we have outlined. They're still going to overspend in order to capture the vote, make sure that they're the new big party and things like that. This is an external factor, an overwatch eye that sends signals to investors that no matter what the government, these conditions will be met and this overspending will not happen. Why is important? Because in the context of crisis, interest rates are going to, like, you're basically, when you don't have the money, you're going to be late on payments in your current loans, because every country takes loans. It means that basically your interest rate is going to increase even more. You have it's gonna, like, in certain cases you can even like it damage your currency directly, like what happens with the bank freezes in Greece when they defaulted on their loans. or even like worse policies that you have to do, especially restrict spending even more in these conditions because you know that that you need to pay up those loans or you're essentially defaulting the current currency. This is when the vulnerable groups are going to be hit the most. This is when their lack of political capital is the most important in this particular round. Before I continue closing.
Your reasons about why this policy will be done would mitigate your benefit, because if you care so much to not anger those countries, you will not be as harsh, thus you cannot receive your benefits that much on your side of the house. Don't quarrel.
No. We can say that the IMF is not stupid. This is not quarreling the debate. I give you ability and incentive in these particular cases. So on that sense, I think also in the very long term, by the growth in these economies, it empowers individuals on the whole. A lot of the policies that and the conditions that we talked about are meaning that you have more FDI. It means more competitions between international investors in your country, which means better working conditions, better options to work in general, better payment, less ability for monopolizations of markets, which on its own is extremely problematic. It means that a lot of these people, regardless of what is their class and social status, are likely to gain access to these things, and the incentives in this case aligned greatly for our side of the house. I think another form of way that I would like to say, in the future you have more bargaining power. If you have already opened up your economies and they are stronger and they are seen as long-term growth economies and you have different investors and partners in your country, you can choose, should I go to China, should I go to the IMF, but you can only have the bargaining power against China not fucking you over with bad loans and bad conditions if you are seen as a good developing economy in the first place. Finally, on the principle, I think you already know is complete bullshit. But I think that you cannot uphold your principal right to help these people or let them choose if they are forced to live in conditions and actually protect them against their own government incentive, which we do much better on our side of the house. And honestly, I don't care if we give them jobs, opportunities, and we make sure that their countries protect them for future things. Because when the economy hits, this is when they're gonna lose their jobs, factories are gonna be closed. I've never been fucking prouder to oppose.
Speech and call upon the member of government to extend the case for the problem.
Before I start my speech, I want to publicly condemn Bulgarians for shit talking our country. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Not many countries take loans from the IMF. This is so because there are internal alternatives that currently exist. Firstly, many countries have reserves for times of crisis and they actively use them. Secondly, they rely on economic policies, for example, lowering interest rates and encouraging domestic spending. Or thirdly, they rely on domestic bond markets to actively accrue debt and to be able to actively survive throughout the economic crisis. What this means is that in the vast majority of cases, as is historically true in the IMF institution, but also pragmatically as I have already proven, countries take loans when it's an absolute economic necessity. This is why, for example, ironically enough, Sri Lanka wanted to take a loan from the IMF, but their specific type of economy, which was agriculturally based, was actively reliant on fertilizer. They didn't want to change their conditions. They didn't take a loan from the IMF. They couldn't renegotiate it fast enough. And look what happened. They completely economically collapsed. I'm going to firstly explain why those countries have some basic understanding of economics and why they are not going to be just printing money. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why, based on political incentives, they're not likely to take those loans and just get the highest button, but secondly, even if they take loans from somebody else, why it's comparatively going to be worse. Let's first give 3 structural reasons as to why those countries are able to understand their economic process. I would say that firstly, no, in terms of capacity, I would say that those specific, considering that many economies are actively different in the way in which demographics, specific industries develop, the historical context, and all of things, this likely means that those countries are the only ones able to understand the specific context that where financial experts and politicians are actively relying upon. I would say that the IMF is completely Western dominated on the competitor. I would say that secondly, they have a maximum incentive. Sure, they want to be re-elected, but parties want to be re-elected 10 times over the next 50 years, which means they have pragmatic long-term incentive to actively ensure that they don't do the most scandalous and corrupting like short-termistic economic policies. But I would say that third, let's consider opening opposition. Many of those places are corrupt, don't have democratic institutions, they're purely technocratic, right? If this is the case, then people are content with the status quo, that is to say actively being oppressed, and not having individual rights because they make the trade-off that we are at least providing to them economical stability over the long term, which presumes that even if you take them at their very best, most countries have adequate economical policies or they're not doing the most scandalous things. No. Now, why are those countries not going to take the loans if those conditions exist? And I want to be very specific about the motion and tie to the specific conditions that will give it by the way. First, in the vast majority of cases, it is literally unfeasible for them to do so. Not all countries are doing those specific conditions. There are specific sub-cases in which they are doing it. This is true for two reasons. Like, firstly, countries in general are very risk-averse towards doing anti-market policies, considering this is a dominant ideology in the vast majority of the world. The financial experts are actively propagating that you shouldn't be doing subsidies, rent caps, and all that stuff like that. But secondly, I would say that in many cases, there is a massive amount of private lobbying which actively pushes countries to be pro-market, which necessarily means, even if in spite of all those pressures, they are still relying on such programs, this necessarily means that it's a necessity. This is a necessity because firstly, in terms of purely context about what's happening in the global economy, firstly, they have to have different interest rates because there are different levels of inflation that are currently happening. That's to say, some countries are more reliant on supply chains, some countries are disproportionately more reliant on other exporters, importers that currently don't exist. But secondly, some countries, as they themselves concede, are specifically reliant on fossil fuels because they have massive reserves that they're actively exporting. So after the increase in the production cost, they have to subsidize them to be internationally competitive. Or secondly, they're agricultural economies, so they need fertilizers. But Ukraine is currently in a geopolitical crisis, and they were one of the biggest importers of fertilizers, which means they have to subsidize their own industry, else they will collapse. The example of Sri Lanka. Now, why is this important? I would say that this necessarily means that it's an absolute necessity for them, they're not likely to take the loans. But I'm going to be very nuanced here, again, conceding to opening opposition. Maybe they have some merit. In 30% of the cases, they're prone to populism. Why does this mean specifically that they're not going to be taking the loan? I think there are multiple reasons as to why it's going to be politically unpopular. I would say, firstly, considering that the IMF is predominantly seen as a Western-dominated institution that has historically used austerity, exploitation, and other mechanisms of actively fucking over those nations, this necessarily means that it's politically unpopular domestically, which means the opposition can actively strawman this over the short term to actively shame you for taking those specific conditions that intrude the European economy. I would say that second, if they consider those are export-dominated economies and many sectors are actively reliant on this necessarily means that there is likely going to be a massive package. But I would say that thirdly, in the vast majority of cases, you are seen as inconsistent, that is to say you are changing reverse. You said that those were adequate policies, that you're necessarily taking them, you're justifying yourself for a few months, and now you're reversing course. Which necessarily means if they are short-termistic, if they are irrational in a way, and they care about getting re-elected, this is massively domestically important. Let's now example multiple scenarios as to what happens on their side. I would say that firstly, and I know this is not the most likely case, but they don't take any loans from the IMF whatsoever. Even if the likelihood of that is low, I would say that consequences of that, considering it's an absolute necessity, is something that goes above anything else in the round, because the precondition for you to have foreign direct investment, for you to be able economically well, is for you to be able to survive. That is to say, not to get in a trap of absolute poverty. That is to say, for you to have an adequate credit score so you can get loans over the long term. I would say that second, and here I'm going to flip opening opposition. If they have a tendency to use quantitative easing and other problematic domestic policies, if they don't have the international alternative, they're more likely to try to boost their specific economy using those specific methods. They're more likely to be populistic, irrational, and use those specific kind of things. Before I continue, I'll take a point, yes?
The problem is this is not a loan of 1 billion. It's usually a loan of the tens of billions because it's the only way to get cumulatively such currency amounts. So your whole point about them not taking the loan is wrong.
Yes.
You'll always take this.
Here is where we're going to be rational. Yes, they're not going to be taking it from the IMF, they're going to be taking it from other people, right? Private markets that have a profit incentive, China that has geopolitical incentives to actively do this. Why is it comparatively better on our side if the option exists? Because on their side, they have to actively condemn, decline, and actively signal to people that they're not going to be taking loans from the IMF. I think there are two reasons as to why this is the case. Firstly, on aggregate, having more partners that you're taking loans from, or you're signaling that you're going to be taking loans from, actively means that you are more likely to get better conditions for the loans because they're competing to give you a loan, which means now they have to offer better conditions for you to actively take this. But secondly, if you concede to the conditions of the IMF, and we presume that you are likely to need other loans as well, or future loans from the IMF, you are actively giving a precedent for them to acquire future loans from you, considering that those actors are a maximally selfish actor that just wants profit out of you and are likely to be predatory, would much rather trust the people who understand the local context in those domestic policies to be able to realize what is best for themselves. Which means, on their side, over the long term, because you need to take multiple loans and gigantic loans, you are less likely to be able to renegotiate with your struggling to pay, you are less likely to have lower interest rates, and thirdly, you are less likely to take future loans. So, if everything else is symmetrical, as they concede, at least you have more partners and a better ability to have more bargaining power.
Member of Government for a final speech and call from the Member of Opposition to the Senate.
All good? Starting in 3, 2, 1. I will do 3 things in this Member of Opposition speech. First, I will rebut the argument coming from closing government that there are alternative loan measures that exist. Secondly, I will argue why removing these conditions not only results in a massive loss of internal IMF funding, but the suboptimal distribution of wealth of the IMF to specific nations that do not need these loans already. And thirdly, why developing countries are already deeply integrated with Western economies, and IMF conditions ensure that their monetary policy is consistent and effective with the global supply chain problem. The first is responses to alternative loans. One, this is empirically false. A lot of alternative loaning institutions do not exist primarily because of the COVID pandemic. China is suffering a housing crisis and massive losses of money, so they do not have money to loan through the ADB and through the AIIB and to it themselves. But secondly, I think it's just completely silly. Why would a lot of alternative loaning institutions, which by the way they never mention, buy bonds from countries that are already failing or that already do not have any guarantee that will pay back their loans? I think that the only institution that can do this is the IMF, because with the massive amount of reserve that it has generated across the years, no thank you. And secondly, the fact that a lot of Western liberal democracies are the ones that were able to survive and recover from the pandemic quickly. So the argument on alternatives simply is not true and is simply ridiculous. Secondly, on why you lose a lot of internal funding from the IMF and the distribution of loans is becoming suboptimal and unequal. We think that even if government is right, that a lot of these conditions are only based on ideology, only based on the border for like free market capitalism and the like. We think that this means a lot of Western countries will no longer give funds to the IMF, meaning that there's less funding or capital injections for countries that need to escape poverty. There's less capital injections for people that need to recover from the pandemic and the like in the very first place. But I want to be with the government argument. They said that they already preempted this because the IMF will still have funding because countries want to look good and they want to look like your white savior and the like. One, this is empirically false. Countries only give loans if they expect them to be returned in the very first place. But secondly, a lot of Western institutions are incredibly risk-averse in the very first place. That's why they limit loans and actually already have historically applied a lot of conditions because they want to ensure that they're going to get paid back. But thirdly, if they really want to look that good, they would be giving developmental aid or any other forms of aid in the very first place. So it doesn't preempt the argument, and more importantly, it beats their case in the very first place. Let's go to the first level of this. Why is it that IMF loans or funding will be very dependent on these conditions? Three reasons for this. A, the IMF is an extension or is part of the Bretton Woods institution, and it's oftentimes a symbol of a lot of the capitalistic or economic incentives that a lot of Western nations agree upon to be not only effective, but something that is true to their ideology as a state and as a democracy. That is why they believe a lot in low market interest rates. That's why they believe a lot in a free exchange rate and not a pegged exchange rate, because they understand that this is how the system should work. But secondly, a majority of Western economists are educated to believe that A, this is the most effective, B, this is the only way to generate fair pricing and to avoid things such as cronyism, avoid things such as patronage network, avoid things such as corruption in the very first place. But thirdly, they believe that this means that a lot of these countries will be less risky when you're giving these loans in the very first place. But thirdly and most importantly, I think there's just a massive strong bias towards these policies because of A, prior policies, and B, because of the fact that empirically this has worked in some cases, making sure that it's the most salient aspect of it. Why is it then harmful in opposition's work? In government's world? This means that there's significantly less money going into these countries. Means that it's more difficult to recover, means that it is more difficult to pay people and make sure that they have food on the table and then everything else. But secondly, we think that what is significantly worse on their side is that less money goes to countries that actually need it. And what happens then is that it only goes to countries that already agreed to these policies. Why is this bad? A, you create a bias for countries that are already cozying up to the West, but secondly, you increase global inequality economically and politically. Economically, because the IMF has less money to fracture the world economy into those that are okay with free market policies and those that are not. Why is this important? I think this spins a lot of the closing government and opening government's arguments. If these loans are so important, and if they're a deep necessity that they need these so that their economies still survive amidst the pandemic, they do not get these loans. Countries in Africa do not get these loans. Countries in Southeast Asia that do not have the capital to ensure that they can revive their manufacturing economy do not get these loans in the very first place. But secondly, I want to point out the contradiction that comes out of closing government. They said that these loans are often absolute necessities, that's why they ask for them, but somehow they won't take these loans anymore because of these conditions. We think that since they're absolute necessities, we think that they will take them either way, but it is only on our side that we have enough loans or enough money to give loans to all the countries that actually need them. But secondly, I think this means opening opposition because it's a prerequisite to a lot of their benefits such as stabilization, such as long-term economic growth, to be able to get the funding for these loans. And we only guarantee that there is funding for these loans when people are like the US, when institutions like the European Union are willing to fund this thing in the very first place. But before I move on to your opening.
If we were to budget, the only level of regulation that could get a return on loans is the current one the IMF has. Don't Western countries still have independent incentives to compete with China and to get resources from these countries they can get nowhere else?
First, they don't want to just extract these economies harmfully because they're already deeply integrated, something that I don't approve. But secondly, and more importantly, I want to make the argument that a lot of these Western liberal democracies or a lot of these Western countries have good incentives, primarily because one, the economy is interdependent, but secondly, more importantly, the reputation and the legitimacy of the IMF relies on the fact that these loans and conditions work. Second argument, why do developing countries are already deeply integrated with Western economies and the IMF conditions ensure that the policy is consistent and effective? What exactly are the decent conditions of these developing countries? Something all teams in debate significantly ignored. Three things. A, they suffered persistent inflation, not just only to supply net bottlenecks, but secondly and more importantly, because they overreacted to the COVID-19 pandemic. Even if it is true that government said that a lot of their economists and government regulators had good incentives on their people, that was particularly the problem. They overspent. They overspent on things such as subsidies on food, subsidies on fuel, subsidies on fertilizers, even if there were no goods present in the market, even if there were no supply chains making sure that people could buy these goods in the very first place. That's why the pressure to overspend now, not just structurally, but the massive miscalculation of subsidies and funding resulted in inflation getting worse in a lot of these developing countries. That's why even if you have a lot of funding for your fertilizer, you do not have enough fertilizer to go around in the market. But secondly and more importantly, this resulted in a escalation or a race to the bottom of the overheating of the economy, making it significantly worse. Why then do we fix this coming from opposing opposition? We think, one, you reduce uncertainty in the artificial transaction costs of trading with a lot of these developing countries. And this primarily exists because you work on a free market exchange rate. You work on things such as a free market interest rate that ensures not only that you reduce uncertainty, as mentioned by Deputy Leader of Opposition, but you have the same monetary structures, the same monetary policy as Western countries that are more willing to trade you and more willing to invest with you in the very first place. For all these reasons and more, the motion falls. Thank you.
Opposition for a final speech and call upon the government whip to conclude the prop bench.
A very important lesson we learned from the service is the following. They meddle between Russia and the EU for a very simple reason. They have both options and they make it to the best of their abilities. This is what we stand for. Firstly, clarifying a bit of what we run for our CEO and then our openings. One, I think what we essentially run to you is the following. We give you a lot of reasons as to firstly, why it's like that countries themselves know what's best for them in terms of practical reasons and more so that economic and monetary policy is done by technocrats most of the time, thus disproving a lot of the political incentives that are happening on the opposition side. But secondly, we prove to you why, when you need those loans the most, lucrative deals from China and other malicious actors are likely to happen, and why this is very bad. Firstly, on CEO, they say, you don't have other options because China has a housing crisis. Note that China was one of the least impacted countries from the crisis for very reasons such as they could limit, for example, the amount of COVID that they have with zero COVID policy, or generally to limit the output and like people going out, blah, blah, blah. This means that one, even if they're a bit weaker, they still give out a lot of loans. You can see this, for example, with Vietnam and other Central Asian countries right now. Why is this the case? Because China always has the incentive to make countries on their side of the house. Three reasons. One, they're competing with the US for deals specifically right now when countries are weaker and when they can still amend them into good deals that are good for them, such as to later be able to take their ports, to corrupt their job. I think this is something that they always have to do and always want to do. But lastly, I would say that the competition right now is the following. When IMF has strict rules that you want to follow, countries go to China because they're more lenient and get into the trap of getting fucked over in the future. This is what we want to prevent. Secondly though, they say that countries generally give reasons as to why the IMF is like, I don't know, people don't want to give them money and blah blah blah. First, you know, this is a stop to the openings. I think it's inherently no characterization to exist. But secondly, I would say not that most countries that invest in the IMF do not get into the sense that they will always get their loans back. This can be looked, for example, when countries bailed out Greece and did not want their loans back, specifically because they know that this is something that sometimes happens. But secondly, most countries go into this knowing that there is a risk, right, that they might not be able to pay this off because they are poor countries, that anything may happen. I'm unsure why, if you don't implement those specific policies that they claim about, you will not want to invest. Because no, if we prove to you that you will be able to substantially deal well with this, I think this is something that you can buy. But thirdly, their whole argument relies on this generally making you better able to repay your loan. However, they never really prove the reasons as to why this makes you economically better. All do this. What we disprove on their side of the house is the following. We say that if this is that good in terms of the economy, I think you do those policies will be done symmetrically because you do want to lower inflation. You do want to make sure that you're market competitive. The reason right now where it's conflicting policy is the following. We are in a very weird situation when there's hyperinflation and recession at the same fucking time. And it depends on a country-to-country basis to regulate those economies in a way that is best for them. Forcing those who support them would make it worse on their side for you to be able to pay your loan back. Because if your economy gets bad, you will not be able to pay it back in that sort of case. Thirdly though, on the weighing up, I think what we weigh out is the following. Even if some countries pull out, even though they will be heavily scrutinized by their populations that actively support you helping developing countries, even though this actively harms the ability for Western nations to take lucrative deals for developing countries and make sure they get oil or other allies in terms of organizations such as the UN, I think this is marginal compared to the sight of some developing countries who will be forced to take out the loan from bad actors and get into a worse political situation where, firstly, in the long term, their people and populations are harmed because they cannot receive the benefit of those investments, or secondly, because generally it makes you allies with countries that want to fuck you up later. Secondly, on take rate, I think there are two things on this. Firstly, they are correct. OG never proved why you necessarily have the ability to do those economic decisions well in your country. We do this as well. But I think it's very interesting as to what they wrote because they actively try to prove to you that you have incentives to do bad economic policy, even though they prove, for example, things that you want to win the elections. I'll just put this point. Firstly, know that generally the impacts of you having a bad economy can be felt in the short term as well. This looks like if your country doesn't fix inflation, you can feel literally that your money buys less. You see how the price of the milk where you every day go to the store is going up, and it's something that you can rationalize. If they say, and one of the reasons is you want to win elections, I think it's more important for people to see the economic benefits of the investment as opposed to what they say about some jobs being happening, right? Because if you see that your money buys less, or you generally are weaker economically, this is something that's very important. Secondly, know that the economy of the state is just a very big voting issue, and this is because it's very easy to understand it. You do not need a PhD to understand that your country right now is experiencing a recession where you see that your shops are empty or because you don't have a job right now. I think it's easy for you to scrutinize the state to the point of which your economy is not good. But thirdly, and I think this is the best reason, I think most of the economic policies that they're talking about overspending cannot always be changed by this motion itself, right? This motion targets more so monetary policy at best, even if they limit spending. I think what we proved to you about how this is done by technocrats who always have the incentive for this to be done, well, I think it's more intuitive as to why you're able to do this.
In your best case, maybe you have some countries being able to have a bit more growth because the IMF is apparently stupid, versus all the other countries like Greece who literally have no money when they're not able to pay because of the deficit ratio is low.
Again, I think what's the problem in their case is that they really give the benefits to what it's good for you to do those policies, like economic investment, growth of the nation, people having jobs, and I think this is something that you would want on your side of the house when, for example, your populists can say, look, we gave you new jobs, we made businesses come to our country, so on and so forth. But lastly, on business investment, know that they are actively firstly lying about why you get business investment, because right now developing countries have low interest rates and that's how they're able to attract businesses. On their side, you increase them so to deal with inflation, right? This in the long term means you have worse economics in terms of businesses do not come to your country to provide jobs. Or secondly, if you remove the subsidy, it means that your fuel becomes more expensive and less market competitive in the future, fucking up your economy
and disallowing you to be more independent. Now, lastly, on our openings. I'm very happy for OGB, for CO being here because it doesn't mean I have to stop, but they are correct. Their principle can be not fulfilled by any conditions of the IMF, right? Any condition that the IMF would have is something that infringes on your autonomy to have this loan. I think this is something that you generally don't care as much. But secondly, I think what about their practicality is the missing link is they never explain why you as a domestic country have the ability to make the policy in a good way, thus removing you out of the crisis, which is a critical thing that we bring on their side of the house. But secondly, economic development and the reaction that you have to the crisis is something that is contested by opposition teams. What we prove to you is that once the IMF is less strict with those conditions, you're better able to take those nations in the Western mindset and help them improve, not lure them to China. Very proud to propose.
Government Whip for a fine speech and calls on the opposition whip to conclude this quarter-final.
I want you to notice the huge contradiction in the closing government case. The logical endpoint of their extension is that countries will take out loans from China, and therefore there will not be any conditions on those loans. They are the side that is defending a world in which countries do not have any conditions on their loans. So if you believe all of their arguments on why not having conditions is good, presumably they must think that taking loans from China is also good. Aside from that, they have not given you any impact as to why taking money out from China is bad. They have no impact in the round. Secondly, their claim rests on the idea that there is an alternative for getting loans. I think they totally dropped the bond market idea because of Madrid's bonds. They're moving towards China. I want to explain why China is not an adequate alternative. One, numerically speaking, Chinese capital is just far smaller than American capital. The AIIB only has maybe 10% of the capital that IMF has, and therefore maybe some countries can lend from China, but all of those countries have already taken out loans, and therefore it's unclear what the additional countries taking out money from China is. Secondly, China is pivoting internally. Maddie told you, China's failing economically, and maybe the zero COVID thing was true like 10 weeks ago. It's clearly not true anymore. China does not have much more money to lend out to other nations. They are pivoting to supporting and propping up their economy internally. This argument makes no sense. Three, we would argue that the vast majority of countries that want to take out loans from China have already done so. That is, these are countries that would have prioritized their ties to China over their ties to Western institutions. Therefore, there's no additional countries that would make this prioritization. The meaningful difference in the round then is in terms of what comes to the other countries that are remaining. We would prefer that they take out IMF loans, and the IMF is able to give out loans to them. The final thing I want to deal with, though, is I think closing government's own framing hurts them. Because if their framing is that these countries are in an absolutely desperate situation and must take out loans, I don't think it's very true that they're going to engage in other policies like quantitative easing, for example, which is the bulk of the extension coming from the member's speech. Obviously, lots of politicians understand that if you do not stop the problem right now, this is their own analysis, then you're going to be harmed in the long run in 10 years, in 20 years. And they do not want to be the one that was responsible for that because of the fact that they did not take out a loan. That necessarily means that they are likely to take out a loan. The question then in the round is, are countries actually capable of taking out loans? And this is not a question of like, do countries want to, but is there enough money in the pool for countries to take out loans? Because that is the determining factor. Both sides agree that countries understand what circumstances they are in. Both sides agree that countries need capital. The question is how much capital you have. This takes out the closing government extension. I'll take a POI from Germany.
If Western economies are so integrated, as your member tells us, with these developing countries, is it in their interest if developing countries flop without loans or flop because they don't do the right things with the money?
One, the integration is more biased towards the Western countries, i.e. like the Western countries don't necessarily rely on the other nations, but the developing nations do rely on these nations. I want to then talk about weighing against opening opposition and why loans are having the capital in the first place is the most important thing in the round. I want to talk about our extension. Closing government's response to our extension is to say that obviously Western countries don't understand that they won't always get their money back, and we agree. This is not about profit incentives. In fact, Maddie's mechanisms were not reliant on what the profit incentives of Western countries were. It was reliant on why they are loaning out money in the first place. They do not care about profit. What they are trying to push is the ideology between the Bretton Woods institutions. They don't respond to this claim. happens in some instances, obviously they understand that sometimes they lose money. But they want to lose money at a particular benefit, which is to be able to support the kinds of ideologies that they believe in. If you can no longer support those ideologies, it is unlikely that they're going to be giving out loans. Second thing I want to do in terms of weighing against opening opposition. I think opening opposition gives you a lot of good reasons to believe that maybe these policies are good. But I do understand that there's a lot of pushback from both governments that says, oh, but in certain instances, these policies are likely to be bad, that different nations have different ways of developing their economy. I think we agree to some extent. Obviously, there are different ways of developing your economy. Some countries get success by doing things like protectionism, i.e. the Asian tigers. Other countries get more success by doing things like free trade and integrating yourself into the Western economy. The question, though, is given that both of these ways of getting economic development require a huge amount of capital injection, especially when your nation is going through an economic crisis. The question of this round is capital. That means that maybe their benefits might be true, but it relies on the fact that countries are willing to give out loans in the first place. The opening government preemption, for extension, is to say that, oh, but the IMF would lend money anyway because they want to give loans and they still want to trade with these countries. Obviously, the logical conclusion of this argument is that if they want to give loans because they want to continue trading, they want to believe that these developing nations would be successful if you give out a loan. This is the IMF's conception of how you countries are likely to get success, and therefore that means that this is the only way you're able to increase capital. Thank you. Finally, I want to deal with opening government. I don't think they have much weight in the round. Opening government talks about two things. The first thing is in terms of the principle. I think my POI already kind of responds to the principle, but more importantly, I would just like to note that their principle is just a pure assertion. There's no actual reason as to why someone who is lending you money doesn't have rights to impose the fact that you want to get your money back to some extent. Secondly, though, I think there are more tangible impacts in the round, is in terms of why these are harmful to other nations. First of all, I think their entire argument of both opening government and closing government relies on a faulty premise that says if something is good for the West, then by definition it must be bad for developing countries. They don't ever prove why this is true. The meaningful contribution from closing opposition is to explain why, given the economy already revolves around the West, things that are good for the West and things that the West are pushing are likely things that are better for developing nations. Secondly, the opening government gives you some responses to say that, oh, but like these countries do consider their incentives, or like the IMF has really bad incentives. Opening opposition just asserts that they have good incentive and tells us how they would implement their policies. I think the actual reasonable response to be giving is that these nations they understand that if these countries were to flop, they would also lose money. So presumably their incentives aren't terrible. Finally, I think the premise of the opening government case is to say that spending more money is always good. But the problem is that when you spend more, it is a question of what exactly you are spending on, whether you are able to prop up your economy in the long run. That only happens on our side. At the end of the day, maybe there are multiple ways of getting economic development. The question in this round is, any way of getting economic development relies on the existence of capital. We have much, much more capital to give out to every single developing nation. We are so proud to stand for closing opposition.